非常感谢李女士。首先呢，我想向各位致早安，向大家带来津巴布韦的问候。有人呢可能去过津巴布韦，我也想带去给都戛纳我们的总统的问候。在津巴布韦呢，我们正在经历一场转型。最近过去的1年到现在，推出了国家开发战略17，关键是要转型3大关键领域：农业、再看矿业，在矿业，我们是要做附加值的改善，所以从矿业到农业到制造，里面的一个关键就是能源、能效。我们已经注意到，我们面临着很多的挑战。如果能源不足，没有办法生产，没有办法交易，所以我们应该怎么做呢？这里呢，我想暂停一会儿，在下一个问题上呢，我也可以再讨论我们能够增加能源方面的一些做法。好，一会儿呢，我们再回到您这里。下一位呢，我想问辛保安先生，国家电力、国家电网
最大的公用事业单位。国家电网如何在中国的各个行业、经济和居民生活方面加速向更加清洁、安全和可负担的能源体系转型？
感谢主持人，女士们、先生们，大家早上好！非常高兴参加今天这样一个论坛。大家知道，有效应对气候变化、推动能源转型是关键，而推动能源转型最重要的就是要推动能源清洁、低碳、高效的发展。国家电网公司作为全球最大的公用事业企业，我们坚决地扛起能源绿色转型的责任担当，在中国加快构建新型电力系统。一方面，我们制定了公司实现双碳目标的行动方案和构建新型电力系统行动方案。第二呢，我们加大重大科技项目的投资力度，加大科技的研发攻关，发起成立了新型电力系统创新联盟，新能源并网和消纳的能力。我们已累计建成了33项特高压输变电工程，建成了全球最大的新能源云平台。通过这样一个平台，累计接入的新能源场站超过了440万座，新能源的装机规模超过了7亿千瓦。第四个呢，我们是大力发展抽出蓄能电站，支持新型储能技术的发展，不断地提高电网的柔性调节能力。第五是促进终端能源消费的电气化，因为大家知道，电力是清洁高效的2次能源。那么，提高电力在终端能源消费的比重，对于我们推动能源转型至关重要。我们积极地开展了以电代煤、以电代油、以电代气的活动提高电能在终端能源消费的比重。目前，中国电能在终端能源的消费比重已经达到了27%， 未来这样一个比例呢还会进一步提高。同时，大家知道，能源的转型需要付出一定的成本。一方面，我们要促进能源的清洁低碳转型；一方面，还要安全、可负担、可持续。我们在推动转型的过程中啊，立足把转型和保供、和发展、和稳价统筹的处理好。目前中国的平均的电价的水平始终在全球保持较低的水平，其中我们的居民和农业的用电保持在最低的水平。同时，电网的安全运行的水平和供电的可靠性大幅提高，我们的营商环境在全球位列前茅所以广大的电力用户的获得感。
Thank you. Well,
非常感谢，帮助我们描述了中国的能源转型一些挑战呢，还有一些成就。中国现在所做的工作呢，规模很大。Simon， 你们除了做宏观的一些工作呢，还有一些微型的工作您住在津巴布韦，在您的工作里面，你可以看到，在这个发展中国家能源平等性如何。感谢各位女士们、先生们。早上好。首先呢，我想说非常荣幸再次回到了天津，回到了中国。我们也都知道，也意识到能源转型到洁净能源，还有气候冲突这个呢都是全球性的挑战，需要全球性的解决方案，需要协调，需要关系，需要信任。这也是。
This economy is again growing after a period of COVID. We have a great panel with us. Dr. Ngozi will also join us shortly. Some logistical challenges this morning. Of course, we would have hoped that the backdrop of this meeting had even been better. I'm then thinking about the global outlook, but this panel is about making best out of a situation where we do have growing inflation. We also have growing geopolitical uncertainty, and we also have financial challenges around our financial institutions. But there's also opportunities when it comes to reviving economic growth. Unfortunately, this year we're seeing economic growth of 2.8% compared to last year 3.4%. We will have to make sure that we are not moving into like a lost decade. We need to revive growth, and that has to be done also by cooperation. And trade is playing an important part here. For many years, trade was the driving engine for growth. Trade used to grow around 6% per year. Now it's growing 2%. And if we introduce new tariffs and like beggar thy neighbor approach instead of prosper your neighbor approach, we will not get back on a sustainable growth trajectory. And IMF, International Monetary Fund, also just came out with a report saying that if we go into a decoupling situation, it will shave off 7% of global GDP. That is like a depression, so that has to be avoided. So to discuss this, the opportunities, but also the challenges, as I said, you really have a great panel. We're so happy that you could join us here during summer Davos. On my right-hand side, we have Chris Hipkins, Prime Minister of New Zealand. Welcome, sir. Then we have Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, just coming from Paris. So welcome, Madam Prime Minister. We have then, not traveling so far, but coming from one of the fastest growing economies in the world, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, Prime Minister of Vietnam. Warm welcome. And then, last but not least, Chairman CHANG of SASAC, in charge of many of the important companies in China. Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
So, maybe start with New Zealand and you, Prime Minister Hipkins. You just took over as Prime Minister, and I know that you're very passionate about New Zealand also growing a green economy. And how can you see the green transition of your economy as an opportunity to revive growth? Some people think that green will bring down growth and not increase growth, but I guess you have thought this through very much.
Well, from a New Zealand perspective, a transition to a greener economy is critical for us. We rely on our clean green reputation and image around the world in order to sell the things that we produce. And increasingly, in a world where awareness of climate change is becoming more and more pronounced every day, consumers are increasingly looking for products that are clean and green. So for our exporters, being able to market internationally as a clean green brand is vitally important, but we also have to make sure we're backing that up by ensuring that what we produce actually is produced in a way that's clean, green and sustainable. There's also enormous opportunities for our local economy in electricity in New Zealand is cheaper, more affordable than electricity generated from fossil fuels. So there can be significant economic savings to be made through greater energy efficiency drive.
And I know that New Zealand is also very active when it comes to trade and trade negotiations, but also establishing a lot of free trade agreements all over the world. How do you see this also in relations to multilateral agreements? It's not coming instead of WTO and multilaterals, I guess?
We believe very firmly in an international rules-based system for trade. Multilateral and bilateral trade agreements are incredibly important to New Zealand, and we've been focusing on both of those. There have been some recent examples of quite big bilateral free trade agreements, including a free trade agreement here in China that was signed in 2008 and has recently been upgraded in 2021, and other bilateral agreements. But we're also very committed to the role that we can play as part of multilateral trading arrangements, and the CPTPP is a really good example of that. New Zealand was in those negotiations right from the very beginning. Very, very pleased to see the CPTPP come into force. I think the quality of that agreement is evident in the number of additional countries that now want to join it. And so we see that there's absolutely room for both bilateral and multilateral trading.
Are you one of those worried about this decoupling notion too?
In what respect?
Yeah, that can shave off a lot of growth if you have the geopolitical situation leading to new tariffs and protectionism. It can shave off growth. How do you see the G2, for example, coming together, US and China? It seems like there is some disconnect there for the time being.
I think we would like to see a world that continues to be open and outward looking. There is a trend in some parts of the world to be more inward looking. Some of that, I think, is driven by the challenges that we all face as a planet. So where there's more uncertainty, where there's a greater drive towards security and resilience, it can encourage countries to look inwards for the solutions to those problems. But actually, I think looking outward is how we're going to solve those problems. I think the whole world will need to work together to solve challenges around climate change, to solve challenges around a shifting population demographic. As the nature of population growth changes quite dramatically in the coming decades, the whole world is going to have to grapple with that. And so I don't think an inward-looking focus for any country is going to serve their longer-term interests particularly well.
Thank you very much. Let me then move to Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados. Congratulations on the meeting in Paris, where you were hosting together with President Macron, new global financing pact. I think there were made some progress. We have been waiting since Copenhagen for the $100 billion a year. Maybe we're closer to getting there. On top, I think we need a couple of trillions to make sure that we are successful with the decarbonization. And Madam Prime Minister, you said several times that we need a green transition that leaves no one behind. Where do we stand on this? Also after Paris, are we on track? And how can we combine the green transition, decarbonization, with also jobs and economic growth?
I think that, first of all, thank you for having me this morning. And I think that we are all agreed that first and foremost, the world is facing a climate crisis. And what is required is urgent action. But we can't take action if we don't have oxygen. And the oxygen is, in fact, the capital, the finance of the public sector and the private sector. The public sector will focus on adaptation and being able to make the country and the people more resilient. But at the same time, that is going to mean investments within the country by the private sector themselves. Let's take hotels that are on beaches. If the coastal erosion is bad, their revenue is going to be compromised. So there are some instances where the private sector will benefit from increased savings or to avert loss of revenue with respect to adaptation. But mitigation is where the private sector truly can drive the activities. Look, when we were in Glasgow, I indicated that 1.5 degrees is a death sentence for many countries in the world. It still is. And we've reached there on occasion now, but it is the consistent 1.5 that is going to trouble us. We have to make sure that mitigation takes place wherever it takes place on Earth. The problem is that there's a serious disparity in the pricing of capital between the global north and the global south. Some of it relates to foreign exchange risk, some of it relates to lack of information and data, some of it relates to lack of confidence with respect to systems and rule of law. Some of it is unconscious bias. And we have, therefore, to start where we can make meaningful progress, and we believe that is in the area of finance. The private sector funding that is probably needed will be about $1.5 trillion, which means that if we can raise at least $300 billion, $400 billion, we can leverage to be able to get that unlocked. As I said, it doesn't matter where mitigation takes place. And therefore, what we are trying to do is to see, can we go to Dubai, to COP28, with a record rather than a promise? And can we ensure that even if we can't make the full amount between now and December, we make enough progress that persons and companies can start with their projects? Because time is of the essence, as we are seeing all over the world. There is no country that is now excluded from the impact of this crisis. And the reality is that while we focus on the increased capital for the multilateral development banks and the regional development banks to help governments with adaptation, it is that private sector unlocking of funding that is going to help mitigate and to keep temperatures below 1.5. I do believe that it may require some countries stepping forward and not only putting in liquid cash. In some instances, it will be SDRs. We probably need a governance mechanism that anchors this trust or catalytic fund in the IMF and the World Bank, because that then means that those countries that want to use SDRs won't have that as a liability on their balance sheet. But if we can get that done while starting the scaling up of the capital of the multilateral development banks. In April this year, we moved with the World Bank being able to unleash another $50 billion over 10 years. That was nowhere near enough. Last week, the ambition, I think, is to do at least $200 billion over 10 years. We suspect that is not going to be enough. So financing will be critical, but at the same time, we're going to have to then look at regulatory issues and a whole host of procurement issues that have been disrupted, regrettably, by the difficulties with trade and the supply chain.
Thank you very much. Just a short question. There's been a lot of discussions around COP28 coming up in UAE. There's been optimism, and there has been also, after the Paris meeting now, how do you look at the possibilities for having a real impactful COP, not only taking stock, but making sure that countries take on more ambitions?
I think that we have to recognize that the COP meetings are not a destination, and this is just a stop along the way. The reality is that last week Friday in Paris, I asked for and called for, and will be making the call again, that there be a meeting between the UNFCCC, the president of COP28, the private sector entities that are on the front line of the discussion, both with respect to loss and damage, as well as with respect to the causes of those companies that can perhaps help amplify the capital for the provision of an environment where we protect global public goods. And the global public goods will range from the climate and biodiversity losses being reversed, to the issue of pandemics, to the issue of food and water insecurity, to the digital divide, to fragility and conflict. Whether we like it or not, we cannot rely only on public money in our view. And unless people have a plan to live on the planet Mars, then they need to come to the table and see how best we can lift together. No one is suggesting that it is done in a way that bankrupts any company. But what we are recognizing is that if we don't all put our shoulders to the plow, we're not going to have enough money to be able to do the things that are necessary within the time frame that can allow countries to transition to be resilient, rather than to face the tremendous losses that would otherwise be at risk if they don't make the adjustment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for reminding us that we don't have like a planet B or a second planet, even if we are acting like we have a couple of extra planets there. Let me then move to, good welcome to Dr. Ngozi. I will let you breathe a little bit before we come to you. Very happy to see you too. I'll then move to Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, Prime Minister of Vietnam. As I said also earlier, Vietnam is still growing substantially. 6% we expect this year, 8% last year. And let's also send a big thank you to Asia, because 70% of the global growth this year is coming from Asia. I think that needs an applause. Let's make sure that we're able to keep up the growth. But as you know, Prime Minister, there are not an uncomplicated landscape that we are faced with. There are possible new tariffs. There is new fractures in the global economy. It is inflation. It is financial institutions having financial problems. There is a war in Ukraine. All this. But what is the recipe for Vietnam when it comes to sustaining growth in Vietnam? But also, what does it take globally to get us back on a better growth path than 2.8%? And then, for those that don't speak fluently Vietnamese, I suggest that you take on your headset. I think there should be. Do you all have a headset? Okay, good.
Thank you First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. President and all the panelists. I highly appreciate WEF choosing Tianjin, China, as the location and the venue for this event, because China, as we know, is the second largest economy in the world, and China has stood up and built its status, and they have had experience against against the headwinds. And I'd also like to thank WEF and the host China for your invitation to attend this event. I thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to share with our discussion the thoughts and about your questions. I'd like to go from the most simple issue, as you mentioned, and we are facing. What are the challenges that we are facing, and what should we do to address these challenges? Currently, what are the headwinds that we are facing? I think that we have 6 types of headwinds hindering the global development and Vietnam's development. First, the economic recession and inflation, which has exerted great impacts on the lives of people. Second, the adversities caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It could be prolonged, and it cannot be addressed in just a few years. Third, geopolitical competition, protectionism, decoupling, and fragmentation, with a lack of cohesion and solidarity. Fourth, the conflict in Ukraine, which is jeopardizing food security, energy security at the global scale, and other issues at the global scale that all of us here could feel the impacts of this conflict. And fifth, developing countries, could they have the adaptability and responsiveness against the external forces? Their resilience is not as great as developed countries. In other words, developing countries are most stricken by the external impacts. And six, climate change, disasters, and pandemics are posing great challenges to us. So I believe that these 6 issues are exerting great impacts to the world. And Vietnam is no exception. All of us here in this room can feel the impacts. And to address and to brave the headwinds, our approach is that it is a global approach, because the current challenges are having impacts on a global scale. And this second approach, it is causing impact on the entire people around the world. So we are taking an entire people approach to tackling issues. And how are we going to brave the headwinds? When we take a global approach, we need to have global solidarity and uphold multilateralism and an entire people approach, putting people at the center, at the subject of change and development, and the resource and the drivers for all the measures taken to tackle issues. And to soon recover business, manufacturing, and production, to create jobs for people, and increase investment and trade, creating capital flows and production, and creating markets for our products. We are all responsible for this. And third, international organizations and financial institutions. For example, World Bank, IMF, WTO need to take part in the policies. They will have to have preferential policies for the global issues that we need to address. And then we need to activate the growth drivers, the new growth drivers, for example, digital transformation, green growth, a circular economy, and the growth drivers are consumption, investment, including public investment, private investment, and FDI investment. And then we need to expand our market for export to remove tariffs and barriers and trade protection measures. Now, some of us are increasing protectionism and tariffs, and we are seeing decoupling issues, and this is not going to address global challenges. No one country can solve the issues alone. And as soon as there are still other people infected with COVID, for example, we will stand the risk of being infected by COVID. And then we need to also diversify our markets, and we need to have preferential policies for developing countries because they need capital, technology, human resource training, and improving of our institutions and policies and advanced technology. And those are the areas that we need your support in. We also need a proper solution to promote supply and demand, and the confidence into the markets are reduced. And we need to also reinforce our monetary and financial policies to increase confidence for the healthy development of markets. And as I mentioned, and to promote trade and investment, reduce the cost of energy and food. And for those who are better off, they need to have better pricing to solve the global issues. And we're not going to politicize economic issues, and we're not going to encourage the factors hindering the global development. And those are what I'd like to share. And then we need to also look forward to look for measures to address challenges and conflicts. Have been through wars that lasted for over 3 decades, so we understand the loss and the value of peace, not only for our own nation, but also for all countries in the world. Therefore, we need to be responsible for putting an end to conflicts and wars in the region and the world. And then finally, to increase public-private partnership and cooperation to create favorable conditions for businesses to develop. And for Vietnam, in the last years, we start late, but we finish early. We had difficulties in having access to vaccines, but we established a vaccine fund, and we conducted the vaccine diplomacy policy so that we could enlist the help of countries in addressing issues. And we also conducted free vaccination for the entire people so that we could gain coverage at an early age. We opened our economy in October 2021, and to the world. We opened in 15 March 2022. We focus on 3 breakthroughs. First, infrastructure, to develop critical infrastructure for development. Second, for improvement of our institutions and policies against the rapid changes. So we need to build our measures from the reality, from practices, so that we could adapt to the situation. And third, to train our human resources to meet the new demands of the new era, especially for digitalization, green growth, and circular economy. So those are the 3 breakthroughs. And we are not going to sacrifice social welfare and social progress and environmental protection in exchange for mere growth. And the people are always put at our center and the driver for our growth.
Minister, and thank you for your thoughtful response. Let me then move to Chairman CHANG. We know, as also underlined by the other panelists, China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. It is a growing economy. We expect 5% growth in China this year compared to 3% last year. So there is a real recovery going on. But as I also mentioned earlier on, the global picture is quite nuanced. So there are countries growing not so fast. We also see inflationary pressure. And I think there is a lot of interest in what are the policies China will take also in the coming months to secure that growth comes back at a more 6–7% level than the 3% level. So over to you, Chairman CHANG.
Thank you. Speak English, but I think I can speak better Chinese, so I prefer to speak Chinese.
Please. And you
in Tianjin. Actually, Tianjin is my home.
Wow.
I worked here for 3 years.
Welcome home.
Thank you. So you 很多同
Yes. That's why I'm so happy to meet so many of my old colleagues, including many colleagues from the SOEs directly administered by the State Council. Chairman, you mentioned that China is currently reviving its economy. We are on a relatively better trajectory because for a relatively long time in the past, China's contribution to the global GDP growth was above 30%. And for all the developing economies combined, it's about 70%. Starting from this year, China maintained very positive momentum of economic recovery against the backdrop of multiple challenges globally. In the past few months, China has maintained stability in economic recovery. In Q1, we registered a 4.5% GDP growth. Based on the current consumption statistics, the growth is on a steady path of recovery. The total retail sales grew by 9.3%. And on the supply side, we see that some new products and new sectors are registering faster growth. Sectors such as renewable energy vehicles, NEVs. In the first 5 months of this year, they registered an over 50% of growth year on year. The production of NEVs accounted for over half of the global total. For example, also the solar PV panels, we talked about green transition. Other renewable energy forms, such as wind power, in terms of installed capacity, they are seeing very rapid growth. So on the production side, we are also seeing very positive signs for a strong recovery. For the monetary supply, the growth of M2 was around 11%, which is reasonable. The consumer price index, compared to certain countries where they run high inflation already, China still maintained around 1% CPI, compared to around 2% in the past years. I think this year we are fairly good. And employment is also quite stable. For investment, the SOEs directly administered by the State Council registered a 20% growth in fixed assets in the first 5 months, which is a very rapid growth. Nationwide statistics have yet to see the data for the first 5 months, but for Q1, the growth was 4% in terms of fixed asset investment growth. People estimate that in the first half of this year, Q2 will be better than Q1. The World Bank and the OECD and the IMF all put out their own estimates. The whole year growth forecast was revised up to 5.6%, 5.4% are the predictions made by the three international organizations. So people generally believe that China's strong economic recovery helped boost the confidence in the global economy as a whole. But we also have to be soberly aware of the fact that we are not free from challenges. For example, in terms of foreign trade, the growth was below what we had expected, because globally speaking, in the first 5 months, it was quite modest. This is caused by multiple factors. And also, we need to create more new growth points for consumption. The consumption growth also was below our expectation. Some emerging sectors still need to be scaled up to generate a bigger impact. It is our hope that through high-level forums such as the Summer Davos, we can build and maximize our consensus to deepen cooperation so that we can stave off the uncertainties with our own certainty and stability so that we can collectively contribute to a global economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're so right that we have to rebuild trust. There is a huge global trust deficit. Just a short question before I go to Dr. Ngozi, that is responsible for all global trade and getting our economy back on trade, driven by the trade engine. But I'm wondering if we see new headwinds globally when it comes to growth, and that will also have impact on China, because China is still an economy also also relying on export. So what kind of ammunition do China have ready if there is a further slowing down of the growth?
I think the global trade has been growing slower than what people had expected. There are several causes. For example, the trade barriers that we have mentioned, which posed new barriers to global trade. In addition, the policy coordination among major economies could be better. And also, we often hear the talks of decoupling, and related practices would also certainly impede international cooperation in trade. Because if we follow the theory of comparative advantages, then different economies should fully leverage their own unique strength to engage in trade and exchange so that we can minimize the total cost and realize development for all. But if we go the other direction, then a natural consequence is rising production cost and certainly more slowdown in development. And another factor is that we're seeing very rapid technological advances. In China, for example, especially among there is a very strong drive for embracing technology as a major innovation source. But globally speaking, we still see major barriers in terms of free flow of technology. That's why I think it's very important to enhance mutual trust so that we can promote the global economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for underlining what has brought us economic success the last decade, the comparative advantages. I think this system has been questioned, but it doubled the global GDP in 3 decades and eradicated poverty as we have not seen in the history of mankind. So coming to you, Dr. Ngozi, we know that trade has been the engine behind this growth. Trade has grown with around 6% annually in the last decades. We're seeing now trade numbers around 1.7%, 2%. And we know that if we kind of decouple the economy, I think it's IMF that has then said we will shave off 7% of the global GDP. That's like a depression. Listening to the panel, also seeing the global economic outlook now, are there realistic measures that we can agree on that can again revive trade? Because we know that there will be no real recovery without the trade and investment recovery. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Borge. It's true that the outlook, the growth outlook for merchandise trade, we've forecasted 1.7% this year compared to 2.7% last year. So a full percentage point below what we saw last year. And so that is a very problematic. But at the same time, we've also, I want to repeat what you said about decoupling and fragmentation. This situation of slower growth in trade would be made far worse if the world were to decouple or fragment. And at the WTO, we actually did work a year and a half ago to show that if we decouple into 2 trading blocks, it will cost the world 5% loss in global GDP in the longer term. The IMF estimates 7%, so we're all along the same lines. That's like saying that we lose the whole equivalent of the whole economy of Japan, which would be catastrophic for the world. Actually, for emerging markets and developing countries, we've forecast double-digit losses in the order of 12 to 14%. So decoupling and fragmentation is something that the world simply cannot afford to have. And that is why we've been very vocal in saying that this is one thing we must avoid. That said, we are also, it's not all doom and gloom. But before I get to the not all doom and gloom, I just want to mention one more headwind that we need to be sort of conscious of. The World Bank has done some work and shown that the long-term growth potential of both developed and developing country, emerging market economies, is declining. And that is because of some structural factors like demographics, which we don't often talk about. The aging populations in developed countries and emerging markets is going to exert some pressure. So we also need to be conscious of that and to be thinking productivity growth, where we're going to see the young labor that is going to help fuel the global economy. I just wanted to put that down. Now, let me get back to the fact that it's not all doom and gloom. So we also see some opportunities on the trade side. And maybe I'll just focus on three, one of which has been touched upon. I think for us on the trade side, the first opportunity we see is that we are trying to build global resilience in the world after seeing the vulnerabilities in supply chains during the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So everybody is talking about building global resilience, de-risking, but at the WTO we prefer to interpret de-risking as part of building global resilience. And usually there's talk of trying to do that by, going from China plus one or two other countries like Vietnam. And we like that. Vietnamese economy is doing very well. Indonesia is doing well. India is another favorite. But we are also saying that perhaps this is the big opportunity for the world to look at those areas, those regions, those countries that were left out of the first wave of globalization, where there is really potential for business to establish, to decentralize supply chains to these areas, not just to a few countries, but then Latin America. You can look at Brazil, for instance. You can look at some of the island economies that may have potential on some areas. You can look at Africa. Morocco is doing very well. Senegal, Nigeria, my country, which is a large country. You can look at Asia, South Asia, Bangladesh. So I could go on. My point is, let us look at those areas that are friendly to investment and see if we cannot decentralize and diversify supply chains in such a way that we bring these areas into the world trade, integrate them better. And that way we are going to harness the productivity in these other areas. And that will help to spur global growth. So that's one opportunity I think we should not miss. And I'd like the business world to look at this potential. So that's the first one. We are calling that re-globalization, reimagining globalization at the WTO. And I think that's a very strong thing to think about. I think the second opportunity has to do with what is happening within trade itself. If we look at growth in trade, we will see that there's one particular segment that is growing really fast, and that is within services trade, there's digitally delivered services. And digitally delivered services all the way from streaming services to video to internet trade. All these services are growing at a phenomenal rate, about 8% per year, compared to 5.6% for goods trade. So that's where we see the potential. And it's really interesting because that can also be very inclusive. We see SMEs that are involved in the digital trade area. We see youth, women who are harnessing this. So that's one area we should look at. And there are one or two things we can do. The rules that underpin digital trade are not yet there. And at the WTO, we're negotiating a set of rules for e-commerce that could help ensure that this will be a level playing field. We also need to look at the digital divide, how to bring the 2.7 billion people who are not yet on the internet in. But that is one growth area that is very, very interesting in trade. I think the last one is green trade. We are also seeing trade in environmental goods and services grow, harness and seize. So these three areas are the green shoots, if you want to call them that. And I think we should, rather than dwell on the doom and gloom, we should turn our minds to how to harness these opportunities that are there that can help drive global recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's very good to, at the end of this panel, to also focus on the opportunities ahead. And also calculations that we have done shows that 80% of the growth in the future will come in areas where digital services is part of the solution. But how do we make sure that the winner doesn't take it all in this context? Because it also has to be an opportunity for developing countries to leapfrog. But still, 2.7 billion people don't even have access to affordable internet. Can this digital revolution also lead to increased division and also between North and South if we don't get it right? And how are we going to get that right, Dr. Ngozi?
Well, you're right. If we don't get it right and if we don't invest to bring those who don't have access in, we could exacerbate inequalities. But I have one hope. When you look at those areas that don't have access to the internet, somehow the young population, they are more on the internet than the older ones. In Africa, maybe 25% of the people have access to the internet, but 55% of youth have access. They find their way. So I think trying to look for affordable means, satellites and so on, to help provide that access in places that don't have it, and there are now less expensive means of doing that. That is one way. We are actually at the WTO consciously working with the World Bank now on a series of countries, the poorer countries, to help them bridge this digital divide. So I think we need to really reach out and invest. And it's a doable proposition. If we combine that with the youth access, then I have more hope that the younger generation knows what to do in terms of harnessing the digital technologies for the growth of their economies.
Thank you. We started 5 minutes late, so I'll add no 5 minutes to the panel. That means that you each will have 1 minute for closing remarks on an optimistic note, hopefully. So let's start with you, Prime Minister, and then we move on.
I think the global economy has a lot to look forward to. I think there's a lot of pressure on the global economy at the moment, but one of the things we have to avoid is the temptation to look inwards and continue to look outwards. Technology is providing us with enormous opportunity to lift the living standards of people around the world, to create a much more level playing field, to deal with issues of inequality with a speed and certainly with a speed that we've not seen before. And so I think as long as we continue to look to each other and we continue to cooperate and we continue to promote an open and rules-based system for global trade, then I think there's greater prosperity ahead for everybody.
Thank you. I think that deserves an applause. Thank you, Prime Minister Hipkins. Prime Minister Motley.
I think if ever there was a time for the public and private sector to work hand in glove, it is now. And if ever there was a time for the East and West to work together and the North and South to work together, it is now. Part of the difficulty is that we cannot take another crisis, and decoupling presents that risk. Regrettably, it will carry certain countries. Developing countries, the level of decline will be significantly worse than what you're seeing. At the same time, the opportunities that are there for us to be able to have strong activity as we prepare for making ourselves more resilient are patent. And similarly, the opportunities to be able to include as many people as possible. But you can't do that without dealing with basic access to electricity. So everything is interconnected. And if you can put the electricity in Africa, that is going to increase the number of young people using the internet. At the same time, the world has found out how to move capital. But the biggest problem, as you just heard, is not going to be the movement of capital. It is also going to be the movement of people. And if we have declining and aging populations in countries, and in other countries an oversupply of labor, then we will end up with the structural impediments to which Ngozi spoke. So I hope that we will, in all of this crisis, develop a conscience and a capacity to work together cooperatively and to see people who have hitherto been excluded from the development narrative.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh. 1 minute, Prime Minister of Vietnam.
Vâng, tôi rất là cảm ơn.
I thank you very much. I believe that we need to have international solidarity, like I mentioned, to address a few points regarding diversifying the market, diversifying our products, and diversifying our supply chains so that we could address the current challenges and to focus on innovation for the increase of the general supply and demand, and to increase in trade and investment, and then to create more jobs and employment, and to focus on emerging sectors, for example, digital transformation, and of course, digital transformation. Without electricity, without internet, we are going to fall behind, and we need to ensure that. And then we also need to focus on green growth to tackle climate change. And then we also need to focus on circular economy to protect the environment. Thank you.
Much. We'll go to Chairman CHANG and then to Dr. Ngozi.
I believe there are still great potential for China to play a big engine for the world economy. There are still a lot of room for policy in China. I think we should have confidence that in quite a long time, China will play a great role. So China and the world economy is a unity. So I think we should work together. Thank you.
Thank you. On that also positive note, and also on the responsibility China takes for reviving global growth, I turn to you, Dr. Ngozi, my dear friend. You can come with some closing remarks in 1 minute, and then we'll listen to the Premier.
Well, don't worry, I won't be long. I just want to say that, look, I hope we don't spend so much time on the doom and gloom, and that we focus on the opportunities before us. And they are there. As I've said before, I don't want to repeat myself. Let's try to use the challenges and see the opportunities in them. We can grow these economies by being inclusive of those who have been left out. We have a lot of business people here. Think about how to diversify your supply chains to other areas that have not been included in globalization, whether poor regions in rich countries or poor countries that were left out, who have the right business environment. And there are many, I insist on that. There are many of them. Also, see what you can do to invest in digital. The opportunities are there, we've all said it, and green. So we can do all of these things and still tackle the problem of inequality in the world by pursuing those strategies that are inclusive. So let me just end by saying we are optimistic, and we hope we can persuade the business world and policymakers to also be optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the panel. Excellent start of our summer Davos. I could not think of a more content-driven and optimistic but realistic panel. So thank you for joining us this morning. And we'll now go to the session where the new Premier will also share his views on China and the global economy. So let's give this great panel an extra applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
下载中天新闻网 App 抽奖拿好康，小七咖啡很多人都有抽到，下一个幸运者可能就是你。国立海洋科技博物馆门票1张，位在基隆的国立海洋科技博物馆，最棒的亲子一日游室内景点，快来试试手气哦！下载中天新闻网 App 参加抽奖。新北水岸河滨自行车租借优惠券，平日租借只要5折，立刻下载中天新闻网 App 参加抽奖，就有机会5折畅游新北水岸。宜兰苏澳立桨冲浪体验优惠券，你有玩过立桨吗？没有的话，今年夏天不妨赶快体验一下，快来抽9折券。旺币最高一次抽到300枚旺币，累积足额可以换快点购折价券。下载中天新闻网 App 后，输入推荐代码，任选一个账号注册，填写完资料，来到中天复古乐园戳戳乐，上面5项大奖项等你抽，赶快来下载中天新闻网 App 抽奖拿好康。